We'd like to start the program with a recitation of Quran from Idris.
بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم والضحى والليل إذا سجى ما ودعك ربك وما قلى وللآخرة خير لك من الأولى ولسوف يعطيك ربك فترضى ألم يجدك يتيما فآوى ووجدك ضالا فهدى ووجدك عائلا فأغنى فأما اليتيم فلا تقهر وأما السائل فلا تنهر وأما بنعمة ربك فحدث صدق الله العلي العظيم.
Today we're very fortunate to have Fatima Manji, who will be speaking to us about her book, Hidden Heritage, Rediscovering Britain's Lost Love of the Orient. Let's welcome her. Salaat ala Muhammad wa ala Muhammad. For those who don't know her, I'm not sure there'll be many there. Fatima Manji is an award-winning broadcaster and journalist who anchors Channel 4 News, the nation's most popular adversarial nightly news program.
I was going to say lengthy, warm, kind introduction, but it's nice and short. That's good. Thank you so much. Assalamu alaikum, everyone. It's really nice to see so many of you here today. Thank you. Is that better? You hear me? Excellent. Just so you know, I've become quite good at reading people's eyes. So if you're smiling or frowning underneath that mask, I can tell. And I can also tell if you're yawning. So just warning you. So before I tell you a little bit about Hidden Heritage, I want to start with a guessing game. If you've already read Hidden Heritage, please don't guess. But for those of you who haven't, the question is, when and where was the first mosque structure built in Britain? When and where? Don't all shout at once. Nyla, you're not allowed to answer. She's read the book. Anyone take a guess? Woking? Cardiff? Any idea for year? Okay, very precise, very good. Stop cheating. Okay, so Woking is a good answer, and Woking is definitely one of the early practicing mosques where worshippers practice. But the actual trick in that question was first mosque structure. And the very first mosque structure was built in Britain in 1761 in Kew Gardens, of all places. So that might surprise some of you. It was commissioned by a royal princess. And I'd like to share with you an extract from Hidden Heritage about the Kew Gardens Mosque built in 1761. The mosque at Kew stood on a small hill against a thicket of trees, its large onion dome topped with a garlic bulb and crowned with a crescent, flanked by two smaller domes and tall minarets at either end. Each minaret had a simple Grecian-style vase at the front of its base, while at their highest points the towers each bore a streamer flag, looking like wisps of smoke from chimneys against the skyline. At the centre of the mosque was a bright yellow octagonal hall with palm trees painted in each of its 8 corners. These were varnished in various hues of green, mimicking the waxy shades found on palm leaves. The painted trees then spread up to the top of the dome, becoming entwined with each other and giving the illusion that the building was being held up by delicate reeds bound together with silk. Above these columns of trees was a summer sky finely painted by the landscape artist Richard Wilson. 28 little arched windows just below the dome let in light. The architect, Sir William Chambers, sought a marriage between an authentic Turkish exterior in a traditional Islamic geometric style and a more experimental Rococo-influenced interior in keeping with the 18th century craving for French fashion. Under the 2 smaller domes on each side of the building were windows exquisitely crafted in the shape of asymmetrical 8-pointed stars that gave the appearance of exploding fireworks, while the inside walls of these 2 smaller sections were painted a rich rose colour. 3 doors enabled entry to the mosque, above which were verses from the Qur'an inscribed in golden Arabic characters proclaiming, "There is no compulsion in religion, there is no God except God, there should be no likeness of God." Now, although there's no suggestion that this mosque was used by any worshippers, this level of attention to detail and the effort to accurately use scripture suggests a certain seriousness in the building process and a respect towards the religion and culture from which the building was derived. Now, as I said, it was a royal who wanted this mosque structure built, Princess Augusta, the mother of King George III. It was originally built as part of a trio. So it was a Turkish mosque, an Alhambra arch, and a Chinese pagoda. And only one of those remains standing today at Kew Gardens, and I'm sure you can guess which ones aren't standing. So the Chinese pagoda remains. It's a very famous site at Kew Gardens. Anyone who's been there will be able to see it. But if you try and find the mosque, there is simply no trace that it ever stood there. There's not even a little sign. But if anyone wants to start a campaign to rebuild a mosque at Kew Gardens, I will happily lend you my support. And I'm sure we'll get an interesting reaction from some quarters. So we'll see how that goes. But one of the things I reflect on in the book is whether the fact that this mosque existed might change the perception of mosque building and mosques in Britain. And for us here tonight, sitting in a mosque, I think it's also worth reflecting on whether we as Muslims might want to draw on the story of this Kew Gardens mosque as a way in which to feel empowered about the places of mosques in this country. I mean, if you think about this, the very first mosque structure was designed because a senior royal saw it. She wanted to emulate it as a thing of beauty. She wanted to aspire to the architecture of the Islamic world. And I think that's something worth reflecting on. So the Lost Mosque at Kew is just one of the stories that I tell in Hidden Heritage. Over a number of years, I've been on a journey around heritage sites, so museums, stately homes and galleries, what I call the temples of Britishness. And inside them, I find clues to hidden heritage. And the reason I do that is because I believe that Britain sometimes seems to suffer from historical amnesia. We have this popular national imagination, which is increasingly being challenged, but still remains, where no person of colour ever set foot on these isles before the Empire and Windrush and Caribbean migrants arrived in 1948, and then South Asians arrived after them in the 1950s and 60s. And that's fine, and that's accurate in one sense, but it's only a narrow reading of British history. And in that reading of British history, I think what we end up with is people of colour cast as recent immigrants who then have to integrate into a preordained British way of life. And that's something that I seek to challenge through Hidden Heritage, and it's full of objects and places that will suggest otherwise. The idea is to reveal rarely told histories which I think have something to say to us about current divisions, especially at a time when Britain's reshaping its role in the world, and there's lots of debates about the legacy of empire and even what Britain or Britishness is. Now, recently the Prime Minister claimed in a statement that they want to rewrite the national history, adding, "We will defend our history and our cultural inheritance." Now, my very first question to that is, who is they and who are we? Which national story was he talking about defending? Is it a one-dimensional one designed to protect the status quo, or is it one that whitewashes inconvenient stories? So I wonder, for instance, what some people would make of a story that I tell in Hidden Heritage of Queen Victoria writing diaries and letters in Urdu. She was taught the language by her friend and Indian secretary, Abdul Karim. She even defended him from jealous courtiers, saying that their behaviour towards him was racist, something I believe is called nowadays woke. Now that is a story that's part of the cultural inheritance of Britain, but it's not something that we hear about very often. Each chapter of Hidden Heritage begins with an artwork, a painting, an object, something that sits inside a stately home or a museum or a gallery, and I uncover the mystery behind that object. I furnish you with some history, and then I use that history to reflect on something in the present. It starts in the Tudor period with stories from England under Elizabeth I, and then it ends up in the First World War with the story of men from the Indian subcontinent who fought for the British Empire and ended up wounded in hospitals in the south of England, including in Brighton. And I'm going to share a flavour of some of these stories with you in just a moment. But just to say, all of the objects and places are in Britain. This is a British story that I trace around the country, but they all come from or were inspired by the Orient. And when I say the Orient, I want to say a little word about why I've used that term. So quite simply, I mean South and West Asia. and many of these objects and stories are linked to the Islamic world. But the reason I've used the Orient, even though it's an old-fashioned term and does come with stereotypes, is firstly, it's a geographical area, purely that. So South and West Asia. And one of the problems with using contemporary labels for countries is I think it ignores important interconnections. So one of the examples that I often give is I write about a pair of wood carvers who created wooden gates that were that were displayed in Victorian London in the 1886 Indian and Colonial Exhibition in South Kensington. Those objects are now in Hastings Museum. You can see that for yourself. And these wood carvers themselves came from the Punjab region of what we now know as Pakistan. Now, of course, Pakistan didn't exist back in 1886. Then it was known as India. So could we just call them Indian? Well, to complicate matters, the wood carvers were inspired by elements of North African architecture. And then they signed their own names in Persian calligraphy. So there's an awful lot of interconnection there. And I think if we just talked about Pakistani wood carvers or Punjab wood carvers, that would simplify things. The second reason I use the word Orient is because a lot of the stories are about the British Empire, but they're not entirely so. The book starts in Elizabethan England, at a period where the British Empire and Britain itself doesn't exist. So you can't just talk about the empire. And lastly, the Orient is a term that would have been used in the periods that I'm writing about. What I really want to emphasize, the idea is not to oversimplify or flatten history in any way. The point of Hidden Heritage is to develop a more complex and accurate understanding of British history and identity. It's not a comprehensive history, it's a selection of tales that I have personally found fascinating, and I hope you will too, and a way to reflect on what these objects and histories could mean to us today. So in chapter 1, I begin with the story of a painting, and don't worry, I'm not going to go through every single chapter. You can read it for yourselves in the book. Chapter 1 begins inside a grand villa in West London called Chiswick House. I don't know if anyone's ever been there, the Chiswick House, few of you, yeah? So perhaps you might have seen this painting inside Chiswick House. It's one that really caught my eye. There's lots and lots of paintings there, usually of people with porcelain-coloured skins. But this subject has warmer-coloured skin. He's on horseback. And he's wearing a turban. So that caught my attention. And when I first saw this enormous painting, the only explanation next to it was a really small sign with a title, The Moroccan Ambassador. Well, who on earth is the Moroccan Ambassador, I thought. His name was Mohammed bin Hadu al-Attar. He came to London as an ambassador back in 1682. And in Hidden Heritage, I trace back the story of his experience here in Britain, which includes the reaction when he gifted King Charles II 2 lions and an ostrich, which left the king's courtiers a little bit bamboozled as to what they could return to Morocco. And the best they could come up with was maybe we could send a flock of geese. So that was interesting. And I even tell you a little bit about the culinary experiences he had here, including during a visit to Cambridge University, where he ended up with suspected food poisoning after they served him pickled eels. Meanwhile, at Oxford University, one of the people he met with was a scholar called Dr. Edward Pocock. Now, Dr. Pocock was one of the earliest students of Arabic in England. He'd studied in Aleppo in Syria. He produced extensive translations of Arabic literature. He wrote about the crucial role that Arabs played in preserving knowledge from the ancient Greeks through the Middle Ages and of their contributions to medicine. And the details of the ambassador's experiences in Britain break stereotypes about this period. When this ambassador from Morocco arrived, there were already some scholars who could speak to him in Arabic. And that's evidence that open exchanges about his religious beliefs took place. And that's not to say that religious prejudice towards Muslims didn't exist in this period. Of course it did. But it just suggests that the period is more nuanced than popular history has us believe. And Mohammed al-Attar wasn't the first ambassador of Morocco to come to Britain. In fact, it was a tradition that began in Tudor England under Elizabeth I. She received several such ambassadors, and the reason for that is because she had to seek new alliances. Anyone have any ideas as to why she had to seek new alliances? Yeah? Not quite yet. We'll come to that. That comes up later. Yes, it's partly about power. Exactly. So her father, Henry VIII, he cuts off from Catholic Europe. He sets up his own Church of England. She follows in that tradition. And so as a result, she loses the allies in Catholic Europe. She has to seek new alliances. She wants power, that's true. So she turns to the empires and the kingdoms of the Orient. And then we're looking at the kingdoms of Morocco, the Safavid Empire of Iran, the Mughals of India, and the superpower of the day, the Ottoman Empire. And the really important thing to note here is in this period, there is no there's no Britain, there's no English empire. England is a parochial power on the world stage. And when Elizabeth first sends envoys to these places, a lot of the time they're completely ignored or they're questioned as to where on earth England is. And there's quite an amazing moment that they talk about in the book when the Safavid ruler is just quite angry at receiving Elizabeth's letter because it's written in Latin and he thinks that's an insult. And he says to her envoy, where are you from? Which country of Franks are you from? And the envoy says, I'm from the famous city of London within the noble realm of England. But what happens is no one in the Safavid court had heard anything about a tiny little place called England. So that gives you an idea of the power dynamics at that time. And it's only when Elizabeth sees off the Spanish Armada that some of the more powerful rulers think, okay, perhaps this ruler's got something about her, we can take her seriously. And that leads to some fascinating exchanges. Elizabeth exchanged letters with these rulers. I saw some of them for myself. They're not generally available to the public, but I give you very detailed descriptions about them. They're kept at the British Library. They give us a sense of the political relationships at the time. And it's a really important period. I mean, you mentioned the empire. This is the beginning of when several trading companies are set up by English merchants, such as the Turkey Company, and one you might have heard of, the East India Company, which obviously becomes a very important player in setting up the British Empire, particularly in the Indian subcontinent. And in this period of history, Elizabeth essentially tries to seek favours from the Ottoman Sultan for the English merchants to be able to trade. It's just about trade in these territories. And one of the ways in which she tried to win over the Ottoman Sultan was by emphasising a shared theology between Protestant Christianity and Islam. Specifically, she points out that Protestant Christianity rejects idols. Elizabeth writes about a God who is above all things. She describes herself as a mighty and invincible defender of the Christian faith against all idolatries, all who live among the Christians and falsely profess the name of Christ. So she tried to contrast herself against Catholic Europe. And in the Ottoman Empire, in this period, they began to refer to the English merchants as being of the Lutheran Mazhabi, the Lutheran sect, and the belief began to form that because England had broken away from the Pope, potentially these particular Christians were actually closer to Muslims in both theology and politics, and that's something that benefited England in that period. One of the more quirky letter exchanges I saw is from a woman in the Ottoman court who asks Elizabeth I to send them makeup. And that tells you something about the closeness of the relationship that formed, and we don't know if Elizabeth I ended up sending makeup to then Constantinople, now Istanbul, but it's an interesting exchange. Now, something I find fascinating is that Tudor history, Elizabeth I, who here has heard of Elizabeth I? Many of us, right? So Elizabeth I comes up on film, she's seen in TV series, many of us will have read about her or learnt about her in school, and yet in any of these depictions, we are never presented with these exchanges with the Ottoman Empire, we're never hearing about the exchanges with the Moroccan kingdom, and I think, well, how did that come about? Because these are historical facts, they're rich, they're intriguing, they're important stories. How and why do they end up becoming forgotten? Well, one of the reasons that some of these stories may be forgotten, I talk to you about another painting. This one is in Edinburgh, inside the Scottish National Gallery. It depicts a dark, muscular man with a prominent moustache, naked above the waist, fallen onto the floor below some dungeon steps. His eyes are closed, his soul has left him, but the bloodstains on the white and gold clothing covering his lower half look fresh, suggesting he's only just died. Close to his red and gold slippered feet lies the corpse of a smaller man, perhaps a comrade or a servant. In the man's right hand, a silver glimmer shows he's still grasping a sabre. 3 brown-skinned men with turbans on their heads clutch the man's neck and arm in anguish and shock. And when I stood there in Edinburgh, I felt that I could see them shaking the man, checking for a pulse, willing their leader not to be dead. I could sense some pandemonium. You could see other men and what looks like a girl appearing to cry and reach out helplessly towards the body. And towering above this man's body are three white-skinned British officers. The first with a bare-skinned hat topping his head grasps a gun and gazes down unmoved by the hysteria below. Another officer with the same headgear brandishes a flame torch to shed light on the scene, while also helpfully illuminating his Scottish heritage. He's wearing a green and blue tartan kilt and carved high red and white check socks. He appears to be in the uniform of the Black Watch. Between them and at the centre of all this drama, one British officer stands triumphant and powerful. His body takes up more space than anyone else. His hat sports plumes of feathers to signify his seniority, and his hand is aloft in victorious declaration. And the body he's standing over, anyone have any idea of whose body he may be standing over? Yeah? Oh no, not the Moroccan Ambassador, but well remembered. This is later in history. Any other guesses? No? You've read the book. You can tell. It's a king. It's a king. It's King Tipu Sultan. Now, some of you might be a little bit familiar with the story of Tipu Sultan, but a little bit of background for some of us who aren't. Tipu was the ruler of the southern Indian kingdom of Mysore between 1782 and 1799. So this is about 100 years after the Moroccan Ambassador, yeah? He was a Muslim himself. He ruled over a largely Hindu kingdom, but he had many Hindu advisors, and he was personally influenced by a number of Hindu beliefs. He was quite the military strategist and a pioneer of rockets, and he was also a literary man with a library of over 2,000 books and manuscripts in languages including Kannada, Marathi, Telugu, Persian, Arabic, French, and English. Now, Tipu was a thorn in the side of British colonial ambitions in India, and the East India Company, by now a very powerful trading company that's essentially set up an empire in India, was determined to get rid of him. So there were years of protracted battles, but in 1799, Tipu was finally defeated. And once he was killed, the British forces installed a 5-year-old boy as a puppet ruler in his place, and the British East India Company effectively had control of his territory and all the resources that came with it. And in the days after his death, there was plunder and pillage, and huge atrocities were committed in the kingdom of Mysore. And to give you a sense of that, I want to read some of the descriptions from British officers who were there at the time. One talks of the horror and the ghastly spectacle of bodies slain in every direction. In one gateway alone, he saw 300 bodies. Another describes how injured men were left among piles of unburied bodies, causing a disgusting stench. Some houses were burnt to the ground. Women, alarmed for their personal safety, emptied their coffers and brought forth whatever jewels they had, and scarcely a house in the town was left unplundered. So after this manic process of looting, perhaps in what we might call a very British way, the looting then becomes organised. And there was a bureaucratic process for dividing up Tipu's belongings as booty among the British soldiers. And someone actually sets up a table and they register all of the belongings, and people come up and they are handed out various bits of loot. And as a result, many of Tipu Sultan's possessions made their way back to Britain. The most famous of which is in the Victoria and Albert Museum, which is Tipu's tiger, the musical tiger that some of you may be familiar with. But there are many more that I trace in the book in chapter 3. Among them is a tiger finial encrusted with diamonds, rubies and emeralds. It's a piece of Tipu's throne, which was broken up and handed out as war booty. You can see it for yourself if you go to Powys Castle in Wales. And as I say, there's lots more Tipu belongings that I go on a treasure trail of in chapter 3. But I also want to talk to you briefly about the image of Tipu Sultan. Because in the years of the British Empire, as you can imagine, Britain had plenty of enemies. But Tipu was something very special, something very particular. He really loomed large over the British national imagination. His adopted symbol was a tiger. That's where the tiger on the front of my book comes from. He was known as the Tiger of Mysore, and in Britain he became a representation of the barbarity of Asia and a justification for British colonial rule in India. And as the battles with Tipu took place over a number of years, this favourite villain appears all over the place. Newspapers would refer to him as the tyrant Tipu. One report stated his disposition is naturally cruel, his temper is passionate and revengeful. Another detailed his offences against British officers, accusing him of representing Indian ferocity which nature itself would shudder at. Anti-Tipu songs were written and published. Some of them had overtly racist tones. One of them referred to his blackamoor party and included a lyric claiming Tipu would kill us and eat us. A series of plays on the London stage brought to life Tipu's apparent transgressions, including stories of gruesome treatment encountered by Britons while they were held prisoners by Tipu, which added to his ruthless reputation. Thank you very much. And even many years and decades after his death, people quite literally wanted a piece of him, and possessing an object linked to Tipu Sultan held great prestige because his legend still loomed large over Britain. And yet many people, not counting this audience, but many people in Britain today wouldn't have heard of Tipu Sultan. Now, how does that happen? How is it that a man and a series of stories that was so important to this country's history has become forgotten, even though so many of his physical belongings are on display inside heritage sites? And something else that we might want to reflect on, we can discuss this further in the question and answer section if you like, is perhaps in looking at the media depictions of Tipu Sultan then, we might be able to spot some parallels today. So hidden heritage isn't just about some nice stories of stately homes. There are nice stories in it, but there are some not so nice stories in it too. What I would like us to do as a result of hidden heritage, and that's everyone in the audience today, but also the general readership, is to visit more of these sites, to ask questions, to share these stories, because I think that they can be at the forefront of reimagining British history.
What surprises me, some of the monarchs, like you said, who built the mosque in Kew Gardens, or Queen Victoria, who had Munshi Abdul Karim, who looked after him well and then learned Urdu and whatever. It seems they have broken off from the elites of those times and done something quite unusual. Is there any inkling of why this could have happened?
So I think that's something that I try to reflect on in the book, and I don't necessarily have the answers. I talk about a tension, constant tension between curiosity and conquest. So you have this period in which elite Britain in particular, and you're right, it's led by royals and nobility, are fascinated by the Orient. They want to learn the languages, they want to emulate the architecture, they're fascinated. There's still bigotry towards Islam religiously, but they're fascinated by the peoples and the cultures. Then that changes, and I think that partly changes because Britain develops an empire of its own and goes from saying we want to be like the Ottoman Empire, we want to be like these other superpowers, to saying they should be more like us. But in that whole process, us is only formed because of all of these exchanges. And so one of the things I say is it's not easy to separate out what is Britain. If you look at architecture, for instance, if you look at St Pancras or Paddington Station, there's elements of Moorish architecture prevalent. So it's not easy to separate out what is Britain. And then I talk about the sort of curiosity and conquest. So you've got the curiosity, but at the same time, there's a desire to conquest these lands. And again, it's not easy to separate out these two things. So it's not just a happy story of curiosity and we want to bring mosques to Britain. It's never that straightforward. It's done as a desire to emulate power, perhaps. And then once the British Empire has power, there's a feeling among certain elites to say, well, we're the civilized ones, they should be more like us. But one of the things I'm trying to question, and the undertone of the book, is to start asking, what does it mean to be civilized? And who has given whom civilization? And that's something that I want, particularly our younger generation, to walk around with the confidence to say, well, here are the things that have formed Britain. Here is what my civilization, my background, my religion, my culture has given you. And I think that's a very different starting point to a model in which you're told, this is Britain and you must come and integrate into Britain. And that's something I want to challenge. Thank you.
Thank you, Manji. Just to note that the live stream went down for a couple of minutes, but it's back up again.
Hello, thank you for your talk. It's very informative, very well written book.
Thank you.
I'm just saying, with your book, will you be making it into a TV series? It's more easier for people.
Would you like to see one?
Yeah.
Maybe you should write into certain broadcasters and ask them to see it.
Oh, really?
That would be very helpful.
Yeah, it's more easy to see in episode 1 than to read. I'm not very good at book
I agree.
reading.
Yeah, no, I agree. Watch this space. We'll see.
Yeah, and also you're saying the first mosque was built in Kew Gardens. I don't think many people knew this thing. But how many mosques do you think there are now? Because lately there was a mosque in Cambridge that's just built, isn't it? It's a big, huge mansion apparently, millions of pounds.
Yeah.
How many mosques are there built today?
Built recently, or how many mosques
How many
exist
mosques
in
are there
total?
within the UK nowadays?
I mean, I
Because it
guess
seems to be growing.
there's hundreds. I haven't calculated. Maybe Miqdad can give you an answer on that one actually. Hundreds, I would say, possibly. But you know, one of the things that I talk about in that chapter, so as I say, I tell the history of the Kew Gardens Mosque, but then I also went to visit Lincoln, where they were trying to build a mosque and they faced EDL marches and the far right turning up to town, and I talk about some of the challenges that they faced, and these are challenges that Muslims in cities and towns across the country faced. I just gave one example of a community trying to build a mosque. Because I think it's important that these aren't just nice stories. We should reflect on the reality for mosque building today, for instance.
Do they pay tax when they build the mosque to the government or anything like this Cambridge mosque?
I'm afraid I don't know that information. Thank you.
Thank you for your talk. I've been really enjoying reading the book so far.
Oh, I'm very glad. Thank you.
I just wanted to ask, because especially when we look at sort of the Tudor times, actually some of those interactions are sort of very tokenistic.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, you mentioned about we don't get taught about that bit of Elizabethan history at school, but you know, politically had very little effect. It really is kind of a footnote in history. And you know, there's been a lot, not just yourself, but there's been a lot more sort of coverage of trying to dig out these sort of links between Islam and Tudor times and ahead. And you know, as I say, you know, the fact that the Moroccan ambassador came in the sort of 15 or the 1600s even, it's not hugely significant. And I wonder if actually, you know, these small things and the fact that we're digging so much about them says more about us now than actually what was truly happening on the ground during Tudor times.
I think that's a really interesting point, actually. For me, it's about the starting point. Why are we digging these stories out? I don't think we should be digging these stories out because we are so desperate to find our place in Britain, and so we have to use the fact that the Moroccan ambassador arrived in exchange with Elizabeth I as sort of evidence to say, well, because of that, I belong in Britain. I mean, if it has that effect for some people, I think that's a useful thing. But I don't think that should be our starting point. And that's not the impression that I would want to give. I think it's about, well, first of all, it's about disrupting monolithic history. And yes, you're right. Okay, perhaps the Moroccan ambassador's visit isn't as significant as Henry VIII's break away from the Catholic Church in terms of the trajectory for Britain. But I would argue that those exchanges are significant in their own way because they build up to something. So were it not for Elizabeth I seeking those alliances, the East India Company would never have been formed, initially formed as a trading company to the Ottoman Empire. And were the East India Company not formed, we would not have the British Empire in India. And if we did not have the British Empire in India, we wouldn't have the modern day immigration that we have had to Britain today. So I think there was a sort of knock-on effect, and I try to trace some of those threads through the book. So in that sense, I would argue that they do have significance. But you're right, we shouldn't be seeking out these stories as a way to find legitimacy or prove our place in Britain. That's not the idea. Does that answer, is that what you were getting at? Yeah? I think this is something we should be very conscious of in general, not just my book, but others. As you say, there are other stories seeking out Black history or Muslim history. It shouldn't be done starting from a place of inferiority and trying to prove something.
David?
I'd like to buy your book, but I'm terrified it might have sold out by now. Is it still?
I think there might be a few copies.
I'd like to ask a question about the National Trust.
Uh-huh.
I wonder if you could comment on the current efforts of the National Trust to come to terms with the history.
So that's a really good question, and it's something that's come up at quite a few events I've done, actually. And I've spoken at Cheltenham Literature Festival alongside someone from the National Trust who was able to share with me some of their feelings and thoughts and what's going on there. I think one of the things that's happened in that whole debate around the National Trust, so, I mean, I'm not sure if everyone's aware, but I should probably say the National Trust is one of the organisations that has decided to relook at its collections, to think about how it labels them. They started off saying they wanted to acknowledge the role of slavery in many of their country homes, but they are looking more widely than that in terms of the role of empire. And there's some really interesting work going on where they're just trying to improve signs or tell more interesting stories and do it in a very thoughtful, very historically grounded way. But unfortunately, some newspapers have taken that project and process and decided to turn it into something that should be a sort of polemic debate. And it's become an incredibly heated and political debate, accusations that people are trying to rewrite history, sort of questioning as to who should be allowed to tell history. Apart from the National Trust, we've also seen debates about statues, heated debates about statues and whether they should come down or they should stay up, or whether objects should stay in place or be removed. One of the frustrations for me, I started writing this book in late 2016 and a lot has happened since then, but one of the frustrations for me in more recent years has been the kind of heat around these debates, the sort of anger that hasn't allowed us to actually shed light on the reality of these historical interactions. And I think first and foremost, that's the most important thing. And so from my understanding and the conversations I've had with the National Trust is they are just trying to do that. And apart from the kind of very angry pushback they've also had lots and lots of positive comments. They've had lots of people join up as members, go and visit their sites. And I know that they really appreciate hearing from people who seek out a more diverse, a wider, a more honest history. And I think that that's the process that they're trying to engage in from everything I understand. But I think that the lesson for those of us who want to hear those stories is that perhaps we need to be as loud as some of the others. And that would help.
Kasia.
Thanks for your talk. My question follows on from the last points you were making. So one is anger so bad necessarily? Like, is it always necessarily a negative thing when it comes to statues or other things? And in relation to the things, like the objects that you were seeking out, like those that were stolen, like do you think that they should be returned? Mm-hmm. Or is that part of being angry?
Anger is not bad. Sometimes I get angry. There are members of my family who can attest to that here tonight. I just think it's not the only emotion we should use. When we're talking about statues or history or anything politically, I think it's quite important that there are going to be different groups of people that you have to try and engage. And sometimes you have to be angry as a way to get something on the agenda. So for instance, people would argue, unless they're talking about tearing down a statue, it doesn't get the coverage. It doesn't get the debate it deserves. The famous statue in Bristol that was torn down in 2020, for a long time there had been a campaign to put up a sign. No one was listening. It's only when the statue was torn down that we were all then talking about it. So yes, anger definitely has its place. But I also think it's quite important to take people along the journey with you. And if all we're doing is raging, that's not going to happen. And so there has to be a process in which I think you can say, okay, let's step away from the heat of a debate and let's just talk about historical facts. This happened. These are true stories. They're taken from British sources, from British archives. They're sitting in British museums. You can see them for yourself. And also, you might have a nice day out when you see them. And I think that allows you to take a broader range of people with you. And I've certainly found it interesting, the process of meeting some readers, because people come at it from very different places, that I have met some people who say that it changed their minds on something, that they came at it from a different place of believing that there was a process to rewrite history, and not just my book, but other things also allowed them to see that there was a different way of looking at it, and it's not just a question of tear everything down, send it all back. So that's why I'm saying we need to move on from just anger. But of course, there's a place for anger, and some people need to be angry, and some people need to be sort of calm and reflective. I think everyone plays a different role in society and in conversations around history. As for your question about stolen objects, most of the objects in this book are not stolen. In fact, Chapter 3, Tipu Sultan chapter, is the one where objects are stolen. The rest are either inspired by or arrived here through legitimate means. Now, I think it's very hard to talk about it in blanket terms, because there's a whole process of who should have an object, and sometimes there's multiple claims. So, for instance, you have India, Pakistan, Afghanistan all saying that the Kohinoor belongs to them, as an example. Who should that go back to? How should it go back? Of course, some objects should be sent back. Of course, this is a conversation we should be having, but I think it depends on the object and the particular debate and who is asking for it. That's my very sitting on the fence answer for that one.
Thank you so much for that. And I haven't had a chance to read the book yet, but it sounds fascinating.
That's okay, I forgive you.
So from what I've heard today, it sounds like one of the key kind of turning points was the rejection of the Catholic world, and then Britain or England looked outwards and started building these relationships. So do you think after the rejection of Europe and Brexit, there's a similar opportunity or do you think it's more inward looking?
Yes, I do. Yes, I do. And it's very perceptive of you to pick up on that. That's exactly one of the things that I say in the book. So we are at a crossroads. Yes, Britain has chosen to reject the European Union, to be clear, not Europe, the European Union. You can be for or against that. I'm not going to give you a position. And it does mean that there is apparently an opportunity to forge new relationships and think about Britain's place in the world. Again, you can be skeptical of that. But I do think that's a good moment to remind people of some of the history that they may not know about as a way to think differently about Britain's future. Now, whether or not that's going to be a call taken up by our politicians, from both major parties, I'm not sure. I'm not convinced that they're going to be able to do that. I think they're currently failing us, and I think it's on us to start making demands to say, well, here are some facts about history. Here are alternative or ways of looking at things, and perhaps we could forge a different future based on them. And perhaps we could identify pitfalls in history that we could avoid again. So yeah, I think it is a really interesting moment. The other way that Brexit comes up in the book is in the chapter about Elizabethan England. I also examine the kind of, at the same time as Elizabeth is forging these links with the Ottoman Empire, among in popular culture, there's a raging fear of the Turk. And one of the things that happens is coffee is brought from the Ottoman Empire into England, and coffee houses are set up, and they become threats to traditional ale houses. And so as a result, there's a campaign against coffee, and it's described as a dirty, muddy puddle water. And you have these petitions apparently written by women that say that the Turkish drink is an enchantress taking their husbands away. So there's quite an interesting moment where the Turk is vilified. And for me, there was an interesting parallel, regardless of your view on whether we should remain or leave in the European Union. There was an interesting parallel with the 2016 campaign to leave. Many of you will remember there was a huge poster that said, Turkey population, whatever the claimed population was, is joining the EU, and this is a reason why we should leave. And so I look at whether this fear of the Turk is just something that we've continued or not we, but British society has continued to play on as a way of examining something currently politically. We can trace back this fear historically. So yes, in answer to your question, I definitely think there are parallels, and it's an interesting moment. Thank you for your question.
Thank you very much. We'll end there. Salawat ala Muhammad wa ala Muhammad.